Good afternoon, good morning, and good day to everyone who is joining us, depending on where in the world you're joining from. This is just a first very warm welcome to everyone on the line. We're thrilled to have you with us today as we start to dive into some really exciting discussions. So just to situate this webinar, this is the 12th webinar in the local and subnational government information webinar series that we run every month. And the topic for today's webinar, we are switching things up a little in the sense that we are not sticking to just biodiversity in its strictest sense and the advocacy roadmap, but we're really starting to explore some of the more nexus approaches and aspects and underpinnings of nature. And specifically today, we'll start to explore the themes of food, nutrition, and health. Especially how they relate to our current global context of COVID-19. And of course, this is a perspective for local and subnational governments that we're really hoping we can have a rich discussion today and really share some useful information that can equip us, especially in relation to the post-2020 framework. We are featuring in this webinar a very exciting panel of speakers who I will introduce in a second. So my name is Timothy Blatch. I'm a professional officer at ICLEI Africa, and I'm also the global coordinator of the Cities with Nature Partnership Initiative. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to just quickly deal with some house rules. Firstly, just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to you in a follow-up email for all those who have registered for the webinar. It will also be made available on our various YouTube channels, and we encourage you to check out not only this recording, but the recordings of the previous webinars. I should also say at this point that you are welcome to make use of the chat box throughout the webinar. And once we have had all the presentations from the panelists, we will briefly open the floor to some discussion and questions, at which point you can either raise your hand in the panel on the right, and we will unmute you to be able to talk, and you can address a question either generally as a comment or to a specific panelist, those who are live with us today, or you can again make use of the chat box. So a warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining. Our panelists today, we are thrilled and really excited to have David Maddox with us. And David is the Executive Director at the Nature of Cities, a friend of ICLEI's for a long time now. And David really brings a very fresh perspective to this conversation and is well placed to talk about these more nexus type issues. And we're really excited to have his reflections and point of view in the webinar. David was not able to join us live this morning as it was 4 a.m. his time, but we had a pre-recording of his inputs that will be made available as well. We also have Mr. Oliver Hillel, who unfortunately cannot join us live, but has very kindly done a pre-recording for purposes of this webinar, which we will play. We have our third panelist is no stranger to the webinar series. You all will know her very well by now, and it's Ingrid Coetzee, who is the Senior Manager for Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions and the Senior Program Manager at the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. Our fourth panelist, I'm really thrilled to introduce and so excited to have him on the line, a colleague of ours, a Senior Professional Officer in the Urban Systems team at ICLEI Africa, and his name is Paul Curry, and he will also, hope to switch things up a little bit and bring a really nice, fresh and great perspective to the discussion. So at this point, I just want to extend sincere thanks to all four of our panelists for joining us and for your time and making yourselves available to share with us today. A brief overview of the agenda. I've covered the opening and welcome. I will do a quick update on the roadmap and the Edinburgh process before handing over to Ingrid for a bit of a broad introduction. Ingrid will cover why we're starting to look at these more nexus related issues and will speak about how they relate to the post-2020 framework. Thereafter, I'll play the recording of Oliver, where he will be speaking on nature and health from the perspective of the SCBD. After that, David Maddox will take us into a great discussion, and his presentation is very exciting, on COVID, urban nature and health, and how we define a new normal. in inverted commas. And Paul will then, last but not least, close us off with a really interesting perspective on healthy food and healthy nature. Thereafter, we'll open for some questions and discussion. So just to say that this webinar is brought to you on behalf of the Global Task Force, for which ICLEI is the focal point to the CBD and the other two Rio conventions as well. So at this point, I want to just highlight that the work of the local government constituency in the UNFCCC through the LGMA process, and announce that on the 17th of June, we will be having LGMA webinar that will discuss biodiversity specifically, and especially around the ongoing Edinburgh process. So stay tuned for some more information on that, and check out our various channels to get the registration links for that. Just to place this webinar in the series, this is the 4th webinar of the year, but the 12th webinar in the overall series. And as you can see, we have plans to host these every month, and we encourage you to check out our local and subnational engagement platform where all the links to register are. And we encourage you to register and sign up for all of them. It's really, great that we can gather, and I'm constantly amazed at what technology is allowing us to do. So we look forward to having you in the whole series. So you will remember this image. This is our timeline, a shortened version of the timeline. Of course, it's not exhaustive, but I just want to place us. We are here where the little red star is. And just to say that we are currently in the process of the Edinburgh consultations, which I'll go into a little bit of detail. And I just want to also highlight the fact that some of these dates, as you know, are continuing to shift due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for us to find new ways to engage. But I want to draw your attention to SAPSTA and SBI, which are the more formal CBD events coming up. And at the moment, they're planned to take place in August. And then in the top row, I'd like to bring your attention to Daring Cities, which is the next event on our calendar. And this was meant to be hosted in Bonn, but is exploring alternative ways of delivering the workshop. And it will take place in October, and we will share these details with you in due course. So just very quickly to say, you can see on your screen, there's an inquiries email address. For those who are not aware, we are running the Edinburgh process, the subnational consultation on the post-2020 framework at the moment. ICLEI is an organising partner. The process itself is being run by the Scottish Government and the CBD. And we are thrilled to be taking part in this process. And I want to encourage everyone on the call, if you haven't done so already, to email the email address on your screen and express interest in registering. And thereafter, you will be sent a link to do so. So this is a snapshot of the timeline of the Edinburgh process. It was meant to be an in-person workshop that's been transformed into more of a dynamic virtual consultation. And you can see where we are in that process. Last week, we held a series of online regional information sessions. And the aim of those were in each region to introduce the process and provide a bit of instructions and guidance on how it will work. And I want to draw your attention to the red box at the top. The consultation process, where we're inviting inputs on various documents, is open until the 29th of May. So we encourage you to get involved and make your inputs and share your reflections. The red box at the bottom covers a series of thematic webinars that are really exciting. The first of which, on monitoring and reporting tools for local and subnational governments, took place on the 12th of May, on Tuesday this week. And there's an exciting lineup of another 4 coming up throughout the month. So we encourage you to get involved and check those out too. So the way in which the process is being run is through a platform called Attendify, and this is the main platform where it acts as a central repository for knowledge and information and discussion around the Edinburgh process. So we encourage you can either download the app on your smartphone, or you can use your web browser to access it. And the link to register on Attendify will be sent to you once you express interest in registering. And all the links and recordings of webinars, and as well as the consultation documents where we're inviting inputs on really key processes and calls to action, That is facilitated through a series of very simple Google Forms that we hope you will all make your inputs through. So on that note, I'm really excited to introduce Ingrid. As I've said before, she's no stranger to this webinar series, but Ingrid's really going to just situate this webinar by means of introduction in terms of how do nature, health and food relate to the post-2020 framework, really introducing a mainstreaming approach as we start to explore the nexus and interdependencies and connections between these various systems within our cities and regions. So Ingrid, thanks for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and you can take us to the next slide, and good day to everybody. So yes, this is quite an interesting approach that we're taking with this webinar, and the nexus between nature, health and food is really important because it's very much embedded in the concept of biodiversity mainstreaming, which is something that is central to the convention, both in terms of the original convention, but also where we're moving forward now for a new global biodiversity framework. And we see, and up on the screen, I've highlighted a few of the sort of main milestones that sort of illustrate this nexus. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about them briefly. So there's the issue of the One Health approach, which is also then supported by the recognition that's given to the linkages between health and food and biodiversity in a range of decisions from the CBD. And then if you move on to the next slide, Tim, just to start off with the One Health approach. So this is essentially something that is spearheaded by the World Health Organization, but it has found its way and it's been embedded within the various decisions and policy frameworks that come from the CBD as well. And there was a decision a few years ago to incorporate the One Health approach within the CBD policy frameworks, and a guidance document came out about 3 or 4 years ago on specifically how to integrate biodiversity into One Health approaches. And the important thing here is that it is consistent with the ecosystems approach of the CBD, as well as focusing very strongly on the issues of interconnections and interrelationships between ecosystem health on the one side and human health on the other side. And insofar as it affects our constituency of local and subnational governments, one of the important areas that the CBD One Health approach touches on is the question of urbanization, and within the urban context, access to green spaces or to open spaces, with a specific emphasis on the health and well-being benefits. I'm not going to say much more about that because we have a very exciting presentation from David who sort of really goes into that in more detail. But the other thing that I wanted to say about One Health approaches within the CBD context is that there's a set of very clear guiding principles and very specific practical measures as to how one should apply this within the different levels of government, primarily at the moment focusing on the national level and the global level. Next slide. So the next important thing to understand is that when we look at this nexus, and particularly within the context of where we are in terms of developing a new global biodiversity framework, one of the big things, and that's very much central to, as I said earlier, to the convention and its implementation, is this issue of integration of biodiversity into across sectors, but also within government. So I'm not going to expand too much on that because in Oliver Hill's presentation, he does deal with the mainstreaming, but I just wanted to make a few references or few points. The one being that although the proposed long-term approach to mainstreaming does mention the contributions of local and subnational governments and makes some references to health and food, it's silent at the moment on the specific links between health, food, and nature vis-a-vis local and subnational governments and how it should be articulated at that level. And this is something that I feel is important and that needs to be raised within the various consultative processes, specifically also the Edinburgh process that Tim talked about, because the current situation that we find ourselves in with the COVID-19 pandemic makes this link at the local and subnational levels absolutely imperative. Next slide, please. So the next important aspect is the food thing, and the FAO is the main role player here. They a few years ago at COP13 they launched the biodiversity mainstreaming platform, which is a platform that facilitates dialogue, information exchanges, best practice exchanges between government and various other actors that operate within the food and biodiversity space. And as a result of this platform, we've seen a number of very interesting frameworks and documents come out. There's one to the left of the slide, the mainstreaming biodiversity across agricultural sectors strategy, and there's a number of others. And it also led to a series of multi-stakeholder dialogues that specifically speak to this topic of the nexus between nature, food, and the different aspects of the food agenda. And if you move on to your next slide, I want to actually step back a little bit. I'm hoping that I've provided enough of a sort of a factual context that will make sense in terms of the subsequent presentations that you're going to get. And I want to step back now and just make a bit of an advertorial here and say that ICLEI is going to be launching an important document within the next couple of days, which basically tracks the journey that local and subnational governments have followed over the past decade around contributing to various objectives of the CBD, specifically also then, of course, the biodiversity strategy that comes to an end now this year. And basically what is important about this document is that it journals and it chronicles the incredible and very impressive achievements and initiatives that have been taken at different levels, but specifically by cities and subnational governments in contributing to the convention. So this is just a bit of a sneak preview and to keep your eyes open for that. And with that, thank you, Tim, and back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid. There seems to have been a glitch in the sound slightly. I'm not sure if it was just on my side. But I hope that everyone has been able to get the gist. And I think Ingrid has provided a really good entry point and introduction to why we are starting to explore these more sort of nexus issues. With that, our next three panelists are really going to start diving into the detail around how nature is so inextricably linked to our health and well-being, as well as our food systems and nutrition. So I'd really like to introduce Oliver, although he's not with us in person. Oliver is going to provide a perspective on nature and health from the CBD, the SCBD, and Oliver is the program officer for the Secretariat of the Convention. So it's always wonderful to have Oliver with us and have his perspectives, and I will play a pre-recording of Oliver's inputs.
Hello to all of you. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar with you. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you personally, but I will follow up with your feedback from this webinar. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the perspective of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity in relation to the two aspects of nature and health of the wider theme in the context of food and nutrition as well. But the fact is that the issue of the current pandemic and the associated economic crisis has increased a lot the interest on the links between biodiversity and human health as a critical component of mainstreaming in general. And for the convention, this has certain implications that I'd like to highlight here, particularly in light of the subnational and local constituency. So first, it's important to know that when we talk about the so-called health sector in the CBD, we mean both the policies related to the integration of nature into health, but also, and the provision of health services and the avoidance of disease. But also, on the other hand, there is the whole public-private interaction and incentives and partnerships related to the so-called private sector health. What is that private sector? It is the pharmaceutical industry, it is the medical industry as well, and it is the provision of health and insurance services, but it also is the delivery of hygienic standards that we are seeing all over in terms of consumption of food. And this requires national governments to be involved with all other players, including, and we have seen that so very much now, subnational and local governments. So we, of course, in the Secretariat will work with the World Health Organization as a specialized UN agency dealing with this. And there is an item in our 24th meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. Agenda item 9 will be looking at that. So this will come up. It's also important to know that there are many clear connections that link mainstreaming with the provision of nature's benefits and the risks to people. The wise management of human-nature interactions, particularly in cities where poverty and unsustainable urbanization can result in higher risk of zoonosis and uncontrolled propagation. So I want to call your attention to an article that came out by the 4 leading scientists who produced the global assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The Secretariat invited them to make to publish an article regarding these connections between health and biodiversity. And I want to talk to you about 3 of the interesting conclusions in this discussion. The first one is that any post-pandemic economic crisis recovery package needs to decrease the future risk of those zoonoses by using integrative approaches. We need to promote technological and social approaches that aim for the longer term sustainability of those dependencies. It's not just about eliminating wet markets. Wet markets provide jobs to people. They provide natural, healthy food to people. We need to manage that so that the benefits continue and that any risks can be minimized, including through the conservation of biodiversity. Healthy nature in cities brings health to urban citizens. This is why the second point in this article is to look at the proposed One Health approach, which is being outlined by the World Health Organization, and there is a task force behind it, including working with a number of other UN agencies. Those recognize the complex interactions between the health of people in cities, animals, plants, and our shared environment. And these considerations need to be incorporated into urban development policies and programs and practices, in fact, at all levels, from the global to the most local. So this should also be considered, by the way, in the upcoming sessions of the UN General Assembly, which will be looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and a lot of other important issues. The third conclusion of this article is that there is a need to invest more on results-oriented research on the connections between the sustainable use and pandemic risk for the decision makers today. We can see that the thing is complex. There are many aspects. So how exactly can zoonosis and pandemics as human challenges, they're not a threat, that comes just now. They will continue to live with us. And they're not a threat from nature. They are a problem of us knowing too little about those interactions. So we need to do research to take corrective action. Those are the 3 lessons from this article that I wanted to share with you. And it's very clear that as key players in the UN system, national governments, what we call the parties, need to cooperate with all the other players to focus on science-based analysis to avoid the risk of zoonosis and the degradation of nature. So we will continue to work and help to share with you some of the lessons in that. So thank you very much for your attention.
So before we end off with Oliver, he has a word of conclusion that he wanted to share with us, and I want to see if it will play now.
So as a conclusion to that initial discussion, I would like to invite the group in this webinar to consider how exactly you can read the recommendations from the international health and environment sectors and correlate the scientific information that is coming and the latest scientific findings so that we can formulate recommendations to the parties, to the national governments, and to the other stakeholders that are developing the global biodiversity framework, as well as all of those components on resource mobilization, on mainstreaming, on capacity building. We need to know how subnational local governments can help us in improving the decision-making processes for the conference, the 15th conference in China, and health, the links between biodiversity, urban health, and the control of the risks and the optimization of the benefits of interaction with nature will be the crucial elements there. Thank you for your attention.
Great. In Oliver's absence, I just want to thank him for making his time available, and I want to just apologize for the technical glitch. I think this is part and parcel of having to do everything online now, as we are beholden to the internet and our connections. So forgive me for that. I hope that everything is working well now. And on that note, I'd like to introduce our very exciting panelists today, David Maddox, and as I've said, he is the Executive Director of the Nature of Cities. And David really loves and has a passion for urban spaces and nature in our cities. He's a creative and loves the theatre and music. And in his life's work, you can see on your screen, he's practiced all of these. So David founded the Nature of Cities in 2012. The Nature of Cities, he will explain a little bit, but I just want to introduce him and really say how grateful we are to have him online with us. And David, thanks for joining us and being with us, and over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm David from New York. I'm the Executive Director of the Nature of Cities. Thank you to Tim and Ingrid and Ickley for inviting me to this wonderful series. As was said before, Nature of Cities and Ickley are great friends, and I appreciate the chance to talk with across communities like that. The Nature of Cities is we founded the Nature of Cities in 2012 at an Ickley conference, in fact, in Belo Horizonte. And we are a collective, a network, a collaborative of 800 writers and collaborators, urban practitioners from around the world, artists, activists, architects, ecologists, sociologists, practitioners, people who work for government of various types. We are fundamentally interested in the idea of cross dialogue across ways of knowing, across sectors, across geographies, to try to explore the idea of what can we learn at the frontiers between types of knowledge. So we are very interested in the idea of the importance of nature and community. We are the nature of cities, the character of cities, including through a green lens. And so that's why I'm excited today to talk about the idea of how do we connect the idea of nature and health to our questions of urban planning. One of the questions I want to pose to you right at the start is, do we truly believe in the benefits of nature, the benefits of nature-based solutions? If we do, we need to look for ways to embed them in the ways we create cities, not as an afterthought, not as a nice to have, but as something that's fundamental to questions of resilience, sustainability, livability, and also justice. How do we build cities that are both better for nature and for people? Those two things are not competitive at all. We ought to think of them as the same set of goals. And clearly we can think of them as being consonant, harmonic, sympathetic goals when we think of the idea of health, both personal health and population health in cities. So I want to make a handful of points in the short time I have with you today. The first one is that there is broad evidence that access to nature has clear health benefits: clean water and air, the provision of food, the recovery and restoration of our personal health, our psychological health, of the restoration of our spirits, happiness, the reduction of stress. That evidence is broad and compelling. The second thing I want to say, though, is that access to these benefits is wildly inequitable around the world, from the United States to Europe, South America, Africa, Asia, everywhere. Certain people get those benefits, other people don't. The next is during COVID, and presumably after COVID as well, as we try to find our way in this very deeply strange moment, people crave parks, they crave being outside, they crave interactions with other people, yes, but we also crave the idea of being outdoors in the air and seeing a vista. Now, they crave parks, but for many of us around the world, you're lucky if you have one near you. And last, I want to say that COVID demands that we ask ourselves, what will be the new normal? Can we construct the new normal out of the ashes of this old normal? And I'd like to, as a provocation, I'd like to say, let's hope that the new normal isn't exactly like the old normal. Before I go any farther, though, I don't want to seem over enthusiastic about the return of nature to cities. It's cool to see new animals in the city. It's great to hear the bird song because the traffic has been reduced. But at the same time, as a person who has emerged from as a long-standing person of the performing arts, theater, music, I'm also a scientist, but have been deeply embedded in the arts. So many of the things that we love about cities, that we think of as being important to cities, are just disastrous. People have lost jobs. People have lost their livelihoods. Some of their jobs are not going to come back, so I think let's not. I don't want us to feel too happy and self-congratulatory about the idea that nature's here, nature's back, when in fact there's an immense amount of suffering, and what we need to do is find a new normal that incorporates everybody. But speaking of that new normal, how about we don't return to everything that was normal before? Because I think I'd like to say as a ground position, as a foundational position, that we shouldn't return to the old normal as it was, unchanged, because the old normal was part of the problem. Issues of access to nature, certainly, but also issues of consumption and inequality and pollution. These are all aspects of the old economy, the old normal, that we have a chance to change, that we have a chance to reinvent. And it turns out we can reinvent. If there's a silver lining around the idea of COVID, it might be that we now realize that change is possible. We did the Nature of Cities, we did a roundtable of 58 people and from 24 countries just last week. We asked people to give a personal reflection about how they have been changed by COVID. And I'm presenting one of the statements, one of the summary statements to you on the screens from Diane Pataki, an ecologist at the University of Utah. For years, we've been told no. Oh no, that's too ambitious. Oh no, the bureaucracy can't accommodate that. Well, what COVID makes clear to us is that all the things that we thought couldn't be changed could be changed, and they could be changed really fast. So there's this fascinating, propelling idea that the next time we have a daring solution, a good idea for how things might be different, how things might be better for people and nature and cities, let's not take no for an answer, or certainly let's not take no for an answer quite so quickly. Let's say, no, we can change. We know we can. Let's get back to parks and nature for a minute. So what can we change about in this idea of a new normal? And I think the thing I want to talk about first, in relation to this idea of health, this connection of open space and parks and cities to the idea of our well-being, of people's well-being, we can change the idea of access. Who has access to parks? The Trust for Public Land in the United States has a brilliant program that has some resonances around the world about the idea of access, providing access to parks to everyone, 100% of the population, by making sure there's a park within a 10-minute walk of everybody. They have a program that works with mayors to produce in the United States to produce a program that provides access, a park within a half a kilometer of every person in the city. You can see a picture there of Boston and the mayor of Boston announcing their success in producing 100% access to everybody. What's brilliant about an idea like this is it provides a clear goal, a logical, philosophically grounded goal for the kinds of cities that we want to create. Again, that are better for both people and nature, that provide the health benefits for people that we know parks can provide. And it's a grounded, evidence-based goal. And since it's numerical, you can actually track your progress toward it. So Boston has made it. Let's ask ourselves in all of our cities around the world, let's ask, how are we doing with respect to this important goal about providing access to parks? There's many ways we might approach that idea, but one of them I want to talk to you a little bit about today is this idea of linear parks, corridor parks. And this is something that is a lot of action in this around the world, the idea that we might make long and skinny parks. If the question is, how do we provide more access to parks for more people? The answer, possibly the best answer, is long and skinny parks, corridor parks. Now, I'm not saying that corridor parks are best for every goal. Long and skinny parks aren't necessarily the best for biodiversity, although in some cases they might be. But for providing access, if the question is, how do we get more people access to parks? The answer is long and skinny parks. There's just some examples of many examples around the world that of people trying to create the idea of long and skinny parks. Now, we know that this is a really big deal around the world, providing access. We know there's a crisis of open space in the world cities. There's the sources of that crisis are diverse and deeply socially rooted, but it's a big problem. If we believe in these benefits of nature-based solutions, if we believe in the health-producing effects of green space, open space, and parks for people, then this is a problem that we need to solve. This needs to be part of the new normal, relieving providing access to more parks for more and more people. Again, there are examples of this all around the world, but here's just an example of one that I want to talk about a little bit. This is a friend and colleague in Mumbai, an architect. He describes himself as an architect and activist, PK Das in Mumbai. The picture at the top, running through parts of Mumbai are these open watercourses. They're called nullas in Mumbai. They are drainage for a number of the rivers that flow through Mumbai. Over time, they've become, access has been cut off. There are fences, they've become polluted, basically places where people dump material. That's a picture of a typical nulla in Mumbai. The middle picture is PK's vision for greening and providing more access to these nullas across Mumbai. He's accomplished several of them. There's more to do. More people can go there. They green and blue the water courses and provide access to more and more people. And the bottom picture, so you start to appreciate the importance of this, the geometry of this thing, of this piece. It's long and skinny. And what does long and skinny do? It courses, it snakes its way through a number of neighborhoods, so more and more people live within a walkable distance of that park. This is something that I've been interested in for years and wrote about it a couple of years ago, this idea of geometry and justice. The benefits of linear parks with respect to access flow directly from the idea from its geometry, its long and skinniness. The fact that per unit area, it has a lot of perimeter. Just I think you guys will all appreciate this. Let's show 4 spaces that have the same area. In this case, an area of 4. A square one up to a long and skinny one. The perimeters, however, are different, even though the areas are the same. The square one has a perimeter of 8 for a unit area of 4. The long and skinny one has a perimeter of 17. How many people live within a half a kilometer of that, within a 10-minute walk? That's the hatched area, and which I call the people catchment area. The people catchment area is a product of the size of the perimeter. So that the people catchment area of the square space is 2.5. Of the long and skinny space, it's 17. So in this simple way, you can start to see why long and skinny parks provide more access. They course through more neighborhoods. They have a bigger perimeter, and therefore more people live within a half a kilometer of their edge. What does that mean for actual cities? Well, here's just a number of cities. The data come from citymayors.com, their statistics page. Here's a number of cities around the world. They differ in their density, and you can start to calculate how many people are served by a long and skinny park in these cities, given their density. So how many people are served in Mumbai by a park that is 5 kilometers by a half a kilometer? That is a 2.5 kilometers square kilometer linear park. 178,000 people live around its perimeter. That's a lot of people. In New York, it's 42,000. New York is a little less dense than Mumbai. Seoul, it's 100,000. Rio, 41,000, and so on. If we wanted to serve that many people with a square park, how big a park would we have to do? Remember, the perimeter is shorter, so fewer people live around the edge. We'd have to have a square park that's 3 kilometers per side, 1,200 hectares. Now, how many people on this call live in a city that wants to create a new park but has 1,200 hectares in the city to devote as a block? I dare say nobody. So that's the other aspect of long and skinny parks, is that they provide access to more people because of this wide perimeter. But they also are targets of opportunity. We can actually imagine we could have spaces that we could make parks out of, along riverbeds, along railways, along highway corridors, that would provide more and more access to people and provide these health benefits that that we know are clearly important to the resilience, sustainability, livability of the people in our cities, and create just solutions, equitable solutions for the provision of those benefits. That's absolutely key if we want to create this new normal for cities. This is just one thing we might do, and in the short time I wanted to give it a specific example about cities. And I want to leave you with this idea from Mary Rowe, who's the executive director of the Canadian Urban Institute in Toronto. She also wrote for this COVID roundtable Nature of Cities did last week. And she said something I found immensely moving, and that is, COVID has pressed us so hard all around the world and has revealed many of the things that we struggle with in cities. And what she said was this. I'm just going to read it to you because she writes so beautifully. I think the most profound challenge for us working in urbanism through and after COVID is, now that we have seen how our cities truly function at their most vulnerable, what possible excuse do we now have not to be solely committed to fixing it? So for us, that's the challenge, is if we truly believe in this idea of nature-based solutions, we need to invest ourselves in creating solutions to the problems that we have all seen and suffered through in this COVID area. I want to thank you very much for having me. I very much appreciate this conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, David. Thank you for those inputs. As I just reflect on both Oliver and David's inputs, I think we can draw some synergies. Words that came to mind in Oliver's inputs, a lot about risk and benefits, and David has taken us through a really concrete and practical example of what these benefits might look like in terms of how we think of how we build and design our cities both now and into the future. As we know, urban resilience will become even more critical than ever before. As we've touched now, we've had a few presentations that have looked more at the sort of health and nature nexus, but I would like to hand over to Paul. We are thrilled to have you with us, Paul. It's very exciting. Paul is a colleague at ICLEI Africa in the urban systems team. He's a researcher of urban African resources and service systems, and he's interested in connecting quantitative analysis with storytelling and visual elicitation. So Paul, we are thrilled to have you with us. We're going to shift gears slightly and start to explore what nature means for food and nutrition, and therefore also a health aspect as well. So Paul, thanks for being with us. Thanks for your time, and over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm very excited to join these discussions. I've been asked to share perspectives through the lens of food, and so I think if there are the few takeaways that I'm going to offer through this presentation, it's how we can use a food lens to improve health, nutrition, and nature outcomes in our cities. So I've called the presentation Healthy Food and Healthy Nature. At ICLEI Africa, I work with the urban systems team to help local governments and subnational governments to understand the systems at play in their cities, and to identify the intervention points that will have far-reaching benefits. When we bring big concepts like nutrition, food, nature, and health together, the word that should jump out is nexus. And when we try and analyze and improve nexus, what we're really trying to do is improve the co-benefits across sectors. So how can improvements to the food system also improve nature, also improve health, also improve nutrition? So when speaking about food, we can approach it with three lenses. The first is taking a value chain approach. So on the left, we can see food production at the top, can go through where we grow food, then goes through aggregation and processing, makes its way to market where it gets accessed by the consumer. The preparation and consumption stage is where the nutritional quality of the food really has its use. And then all along the food chain, there are food waste incidences happening. And this map already suggests that we should be looking to recover organic waste and recover food-associated wastes and feed them back into the system. So circular economy as a potential intervention. The other lens that we can look at is food security. So this is typically explained as 4 pillars of food security. The first is availability. Are we producing enough food to make sure that people aren't going hungry? This is typically where the focus on food remains. We're having difficulty getting enough food into the city, we must produce more in that space. But often we aren't contemplating whether or not there is actually enough food, and the trouble is about how people access it. So this can be, is there a market in close proximity? Are the right types of food, nutritional foods, arriving at this market? Is the cost point for this food too high, perhaps? If you have a low income and you have to divide your income over housing, transportation for work, and food, are you able to afford good nutrition? The third pillar is utilization. This speaks to the quality of the food, the safety of the food. As it's been produced, has it been covered in pesticides or chemical fertilizers? And it also speaks to how we take in that food and whether we can derive nutrition from that. And here, this is where a nutrition question is really important, because if a child has not received adequate nutrition at a young age, for the first 1,000 days since conception, their ability to take up nutrition is quite hampered. And this is where, from a justice lens, if we don't really invest in early childhood nutrition, we are potentially undermining those people's potential into the future. The fourth pillar is stability, and I like how that's portrayed in this image. this is most resonant right now as our global food system has been shaken by the pandemic, are availability, access, and utilization stable through different shocks. So this can be a disruption to supply chain. This can be through a drought or a flooding crisis where production is undermined. So that is a food security lens. How are people taking on food? Finally, we can also look at a policy approach and how do we integrate food across our government and our society. So here, it's not just about can we produce and what types are we producing, but what are the implications from a public health perspective? How do we engage our local economic activities in this? What are we doing with our food waste? And then how are we addressing the uncertainties posed by climate change when it comes to feeding our people? What this intuitively should suggest is that food occupies a central place in local government decision-making, and that many departments should be involved in that conversation. And how do we leverage the mandates of different departments to improve the food system holistically? Peaches. The two reports that inform the discussion today that I think are quite interesting are the FAO Framework for the Urban Food Agenda, which provides some guidance for how local government and subnational government can improve their food system outcomes, and then the FAO strategy on mainstream biodiversity across agricultural sectors. So this was discussed briefly in our earlier presentations, and I think just reiterates the point that improved biodiversity has great consequences for the quality and the amount of food that we can produce. And at the same time, if we see agriculture, and perhaps I would suggest in this case urban agriculture, as a way of incorporating more nature into our cities and improving the interactions between different crops and different flora and fauna, then we can have many co-benefits. Peaches. In the FAO Urban Food Agenda, they propose these 7 interventions, which I'll go through very briefly. From the bottom, the enabling environments. Are we taking a territorial approach when we look at food systems? So here it's very important to think of the jurisdictions neighboring each municipality and the rural-urban interlinkages. So taking a wider perspective requires that we speak across jurisdictions, requires a governance framework that allows that and allows us to plan with a bioregional perspective in mind. Following an integrated food system approach, with the idea, as we saw from the image earlier, of drawing in different departments within the government to collectively create a food agenda, but also engaging with the whole of society approach. So how do we do stakeholder consultations? Do we constitute a food policy council, as has been done in many cities? What are the tensions that we have to overcome in such a situation? And what is our role as a government? From my perspective, facilitating these conversations and demonstrating what is possible are some great approaches seen by cities. For implementation, the green options, here shortening food supply chains and improving your public food procurement. These are quite popular topics at the moment, given the pressure we are to ensure that food is arriving at our city. So proximity production has become a catchphrase there. Innovating across our urban centers to find new ways to produce foods, either in dense communities or with novel technology. Our conversation has been focused on food and green environments for healthy cities. How I might interpret this is to suggest that food can be an excellent excuse to bring more green into the city. So if you are experiencing pushback where there are many pressures for expensive land and people would have pressures to build housing or industry, and there are arguments about why we need to protect biodiversity or not, food as a productive offering for the city can be a good argument to use. Optimizing supply chains and circular bioeconomy. So in much of the global south, the wastes that are blocking our water ecosystems or finding their way into nature are often related to the food system. In Africa, 60 to 70% of wastes in these systems is organic. And then we have the plastics associated with food packaging and food movements. We are currently participating in the orange provocation here, which is to improve our global urban food governance through more communication. This was going to be the crux of my whole presentation, to share a systems diagram of how I thought the different topics fit together. But we don't have enough time to go through it now, so I would recommend revisiting the presentation a bit later. But here, this is a causal loop diagram, and it shows the causal relationships between these different elements. As an example of how this works and allows us to think broadly about the interrelationships, we can start at quality green space in the bottom middle. The better quality green space we have, the more opportunity for improving biodiversity as we move to the left. This is a loop in itself. The better our biodiversity is, the more our quality green space can improve. So we know already if we're able to bring more green space into cities, we can improve our biodiversity outcomes. If we improve our biodiversity outcomes, moving right from biodiversity, we can improve the amount and quality of food, which then has benefits for our health, both mental and physical. If we improve the quality of our green space, we also can have mental and physical health benefits, features. So this is a summary of a few of the interventions that we've spoken about today. Just to reiterate, connectivity in our cities can improve our biodiversity outcomes. So imagining these linear parks that David has been speaking about, the more we can connect nature with itself, the better quality of ecosystem service we can produce. The opportunity posed by mixed use public space can provide more urban food gardening, access to nature, and improved biodiversity. Urban agriculture, food gardens, and foodways. If we're making linear parks, why not add food elements into those? They can be an excuse to introduce more nature into the city. Urban gardening will contribute to positive social outcomes, including mental health and social cohesion. Our circular resource systems can redesign or repurpose wastes and provide new livelihoods. Taking a territorial planning approach will acknowledge rural-urban linkages and hopefully make your food supply chains more robust and local. This all requires multi-level governance. This can be through written food policy, facilitating and demonstrating, or doing stakeholder engagements. Another provocation is to leverage cross-departmental financing. So here, different departments will have different mandates. For example, the traffic department may have funding to beautify the sides of roads, the inside meridians. Why not engage them about covering the costs of foodways or nature? Things like that. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to share some of these interventions.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and sharing this very interesting perspective. I know it was not an easy challenge for you to sum up all of this and so briefly, but I think you've done certainly a lot of justice to the theme. On that note, I just want to very briefly, I know we're running out of time, but just encourage everyone on the webinar, if you have not visited the Cities with Nature platform, Cities with Nature is open to all cities and all regions, and we encourage you all to join and be a part of this really exciting community of practice that we are building and nurturing. Just briefly to say, the next webinar in this series will take place on the 4th of June at the same 2 time slots on the day, so you can register for whichever one suits you best. This all forms part of our local and subnational advocacy for nature. With that, we have limited time, but I'm going to quickly open the floor for any questions and discussion points. If there's any burning questions or points you'd like to raise, I'd also invite the panelists if you would like. I'll ask Julia, my colleague, to help me identify any hands that are raised.
We have one hand raised, and we have also a consideration in the chat box if you want to read that out.
Okay, so I think let's try and start with the chat box. I, for some reason, cannot see it, Julia.
I don't know why, but I can read that out.
Please
so
do.
Sergio Aranguren is saying that it is important to recognize the importance and relationship between urban and rural in order to reinforce the idea of cities as healthy ecosystems and optimize the contributions that the rural offers to the urban.
Great, so not a question, but more of a comment. And I wonder if Paul, I see you did touch on it in your final slide, but if you'd like to come in and make a comment on the urban-rural link.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that speaks to it very directly. I have a colleague who works on a notion of the future city through the concept of rurality, and how cities as concentrators of resources are so dependent on their rural spaces. And so taking a wider perspective on what a city actually is could be useful. You know, how do we draw these boundaries, given that the flows come from outside and around? Yeah, thank you for the point.
Absolutely, and I think it also speaks to, you know, the more sort of regional and landscape approaches, and very much how this advocacy work is, you know, we so often talk of cities, but we are, you know, it's very important that all levels of subnational governments are included and their voices are heard in this constituency. So I see there is a hand raised by Kamal. So Kamal, I will try and unmute you now, and you can go ahead and speak. Thank you.
I'm Kamal from Nepal. I heartily thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to listen this local and sub national constitution. So I thank you very much. All the presentation is very interesting. I just want to say some question related to the food and health system in local governing or local policy that can relate to the traditional knowledge and practice and innovation of indigenous peoples, because I see the local or indigenous food system is now slowly is declining in many areas, and that's are very important values for the indigenous peoples and local community. So they have that technology, they have the knowledge, and how the local policy should be respect and recognized in post-2020 global biodiversity. That's my concern. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Kamal, for your question. Paul, I don't know if you want to come in and respond. I don't know if you could hear the question around local and traditional communities and knowledge.
Yeah, no, again, thank you for the point. I think here is a very strong decision about the type of governance model needed in a local government. A lot of retailers might come in with their own ideas about what the food system needs to look like. And so taking a very strong policy stance to support traditional food growing and marketing processes is very important. And I think that needs a very strong statement by the government or the governance system. So with stakeholders to declare that we are going to protect these systems and funnel some funds towards doing that and creating pride in those systems. I believe David can add to this as well.
Yeah, David, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, this is David from Nature of Cities. I really appreciate Kamal's question. I think there's a thread, I think, in that what all of the presenters said today, and that is a certain emphasis on the local. And even both the questions, this clear connectivity on between rural, suburban, and urban, and this idea of corridor parks and the provision of food, both especially provision of food locally, all has a deep emphasis on the idea of connecting with local knowledge, local organizations, and I mean all the way down to questions of neighborhoods. And I think for me, the questions of food and the provision of parks, as local amenities is very much about the idea of where are our spaces governed? At what level are they governed? There are certain things that cities and larger governments, larger governmental entities can do, and there are certain things that neighborhoods and agglomerations of neighborhoods do better. And so that's a thread that I think is important in this conversation. The entire webinar today is this idea of how can we empower and invigorate the idea of the local, whether that a local is neighborhood organizations or indigenous knowledge. All of those things are important contributors to the idea of the better city.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very important point to make. And I think that, David, you've summed it up so well and really made my job easy. You know, in that there is this increasing importance to focus on the local and really to for local governments in the way we live our urban lives. I think each presenter has brought a really unique perspective today. And on that note, I just want to take the opportunity to thank each of you, each of our 4 panelists. Thank you for your time and for being willing to present in the series. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, but we encourage everyone to please write to us. Our details are on the screen now. This is an ongoing conversation, and we hope that you will join us in our next webinar where we can pick it up again. But on that note, I want to thank Julia for her support on the platform. Yeah, thank you to all of the attendees and all those who registered for the webinar. It's always fantastic to have you with us, and we thank you for your time. So with that, I will close the webinar, and we hope to see you next time.